So, a new study is connecting the dots between police involved shootings and students who live in neighborhoods nearby, who live in the area where the shooting may have occurred. Harvard Assistant Professor Desmond Ang looked at just how close students in a Southwest school district lived to police involved shootings from 2002 to 2016. And then he monitored their academic performance following the shooting. And what he found was pretty staggering, that nearly 2,000 students dropped out of high school due to a police-involved shooting. So Desmond Ang is with us now to break this all down. As we said earlier, you're an assistant professor of public policy at Harvard University. So this is really fascinating to me, that you could link that number of students being affected by an incident happening in their neighborhood. So just kind of like flesh out the study. What did you look at, and what were the general conclusions?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. Obviously, I think in the past few weeks, we've seen a lot of national attention paid to some of these police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, others, and the tragedy of those deaths. My research shows that these types of events have significant consequences, not just for the person who was killed, but also for the entire community. And so, as you said, Anne-Marie, I find that students living close to these killings, about half a mile away, experience significant decreases along a range of academic and emotional well-being measures. They're more likely to miss school. They experience significant decreases in GPA. They're 15% more likely to be diagnosed with something called emotional disturbance, which is very highly correlated with PTSD. And ultimately, as you referenced, these students are much less likely to graduate from high school or to enroll in college. And so I estimate that each police killing in this county that I studied caused, on average, 3 students of color to drop out of high school. If you extrapolate that over the 600 police killings that occurred over this 15-year period, that's about 2,000 students, as you referenced.
Those are startling statistics, Professor. Why is your study an important piece of the puzzle to understanding racial inequality in education? I think that people may be wondering how you link the two.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, again, when we think about police violence, we often think about just sort of the direct cost on the victims, but it's been sort of an ongoing concern, and we're seeing this come to a head in recent events, that many minority communities have expressed concerns about, these concerns of fairness, concerns about justice, et cetera, and we just don't really have a strong sense of, how do we quantify these effects, what are the effects that these things might lead to with regards to educational inequality, inequality in criminal justice, et cetera. And so I think quantifying these effects is very important for any type of discussion that we want to have if we're talking about police reform.
I think it's really interesting. A lot of people, saw the sort of tragic video of George Floyd and other videos and had conversations within their house, that he could have been me, he could have been my brother, he could have been my cousin, my son. And that's, when an incident happens in another state. Imagine the impact when it's happening in your neighborhood. You kind of break down the psychological damage that's being done into sort of 3 segments, like short-term, mid-term, and then long-term. Can you talk to us about what happens to students in the immediate aftermath of an incident like this in their neighborhood versus the long-term impact?
Yeah. So the data tracks 700,000 public high school students over this 15-year period. We know exactly where these students live. We know exactly how close they were to where these events occurred. And it includes, at the daily level, whether or not they went to school the following day. And so the day after the event, students are much less likely to go to school the following day. Through that following week, we can follow their performance over multiple semesters. You see that these students experience significant decreases in GPA. Again, they're more likely to be diagnosed with something called emotional disturbance. They're also more likely to report feeling less safe in their neighborhoods. And so this is important because it essentially goes against the whole purpose of law enforcement in some sense, which is to improve public safety, improve public outcomes. And what we're finding is that students are sort of reacting in the opposite direction to these police killings.
All right, so here's another question that you looked at, Professor, which I think is really fascinating and important to share. What have you learned about police-involved shootings and how they impact Black and Hispanic students, but don't have the same impact on white and Asian students? What is the distinction there?
Yeah, these effects, there's a pretty stark racial pattern that emerges. All of these academic consequences are borne entirely by Black and Hispanic students. And I don't find any significant effects for white or Asian students, even if they live close to these events. So it's not just a matter of, they weren't exposed, they didn't know anyone was killed. But even if these events occur in their neighborhoods, white and Asian students aren't responding to them. And this difference remains between Black and Hispanic students and white and Asian. Even if you look at students coming from similar socioeconomic backgrounds, similar neighborhoods, there are these stark racial disparities with regards to how these students are responding. And I think that is very consistent with a lot of evidence that we have about these concerns expressed specifically by Black and Hispanic individuals about trust in police. There's a lot of survey evidence showing that Blacks and Hispanics are much more likely to believe that police use of force is excessive, that it's racially biased, that it's a serious social concern. And I think that's, again, reflected in what we see with regard to these educational patterns.
Yeah, I wonder if some of what you're seeing is exacerbated when there's video available. If like I mentioned before, if you watch a video and you see someone who looks like you being victimized, it stands to reason that you'd be a little more nervous and feel unsafe in your neighborhood. The other thing that your study kind of revealed, which I think makes a lot of sense, is the impact is different if the police-involved shooting involves someone who is armed other than the police versus unarmed. Can you talk about that?
Exactly. Yeah. So the effects are much larger for police killings of individuals that were completely unarmed. And contrary to what people might think, these are actually relatively common events. So about 20% of police killings in my sample and the counties I studied involved somebody that had no weapon at all. And these events, police killings of these types of individuals, lead to much larger negative ramifications for students than police killings of somebody that had a gun or even had a gun and was firing at officers or civilians. And so I think it speaks to this story that we're seeing around, this isn't just about violence. This isn't just about the fact that there's gunfire or that somebody died. It perhaps is instead about perceptions of the reasonableness or justification of police actions and what that says about their views of people of different races.
Mm-hmm.
Professor, the other really interesting point that you make is this idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Explain that concept to us and how police discrimination influences that viewpoint.
Yeah, so this is exactly the concern that arises when you see effects with this type of racial pattern, is that there's a lot of research showing that more disadvantaged neighborhoods of more minorities are more likely to be heavily policed. If police are then going into those neighborhoods, they're killing individuals of Black or Hispanic background in those neighborhoods. That's then leading these underrepresented students to drop out of school, which then exacerbates existing racial disparities that we have in education, criminal justice, etc., and that causes the whole cycle to repeat itself. And I think all of this speaks to the need to think really seriously about the role of policing, the role of systematic or systemic racism, as you mentioned, Vlad, when we think about what drives inequality to begin with.
We've been all watching the widespread protests demanding police reform. And the conversation that we've had a lot, Vlad and myself and some of our guests, is that, it feels different than previous times when something like this happened. And you kind of look at other periods that are similar. Is it different? It feels different.
It certainly feels different in the current context. But, if you look over history, over the past 100 years, there have been a number of really widespread protests, widespread concerns around police violence, and very sort of high-profile incidents, like the Rodney King riots in '92, the Watts riots in LA in 1965, Michael Brown, obviously, after Ferguson in 2013 and 2014. And so, history is almost repeating itself in some sense. On the other hand, it's important to note that even these incidents, these large riots, are just sort of the tip of the iceberg in a lot of different ways. So every year in the United States, about 1,000 people are killed by police. About half of these incidents involve minorities, half involve people that didn't have a gun. So a lot of incidents that look really similar to George Floyd, look really similar to Michael Brown, but for whatever reason, didn't receive the type of attention that we're seeing now. And so that said, my findings suggest that even when there's not viral footage of these events, they can still have catastrophic consequences for local communities. But I think it is very important to realize and to recognize that, we've seen these things happen before.
Yeah, and I guess, Professor, Memory knows that I love to sometimes get a little nerdy and geeky when it comes to historical antecedents around anything that we're talking about currently in 2020 or in recent history. And something that you said is interesting to me about the behavior of state agents that are armed. In other words, police over the course of the last 150 years or so, if there are not historical antecedents to the period that we're in today, that have less to do in some instances around race, although many of them do, but just in terms of the power structure that exists when you allow state agents to be armed and you give them this enormous responsibility that they then abuse. And I was thinking about, I just started looking into this just again recently, some coal miner strikes that happened at the turn of the century, at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century during the presidency of William McKinley. Now, this is getting really geeky, but where police officers shot coal miners who were striking and killed some of them. And I just thought about this idea of police in power abusing that power and having it, and it not necessarily always being tied to race.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you search sort of New York Times archival data, there's articles from the 1850s talking about concerns with police violence back then. Even though the police in that instance killed somebody that was very well known in the city as being a criminal, there seems to be something different when police kill somebody, precisely because it's sort of representative of the government, representative of these hierarchical institutions, as you mentioned.
Really, really fascinating. This has been a great discussion, Professor. Thank you very, very much. We really appreciate it, and we'll point our viewers to your research, which is fascinating. Professor Desmond Ang, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.